Shavuot Tov, everybody. I hope you're all well. Thank you for joining us for this tribute to Harav Yaakov Svi ben David Aryeh zt'l, Emeritus Chief Rabbi, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Tonight is exactly a week since we heard the very sad news of Rabbi Sacks' passing, and we hope that this evening we will share their recollections and thoughts of Rabbi Sacks, and there will also be an opportunity for you to share your own personal reflections and memories. You know, in Parshas Chayei Sarah, we read of the passing of Sarah Imenu. The Torah says, "Vayavo Abraham lispon l'Sarah v'livchosa," that Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and to weep over her. And the obvious question is, surely weeping comes before a eulogy. Crying is a natural emotional response to loss, whereas eulogies require preparation and thought, and therefore weeping should come first. And in fact, the Gemara tells us that weeping is for 3 days and eulogies for 7 days. So why does the Torah mention eulogy before weeping? Well, amongst other Mefarshim, the Yaakov explains that the feeling of loss, which normally weakens with time, actually grew stronger after Sarah's passing. And therefore weeping for Sarah continued long after the eulogies had stopped. Friends, we find ourselves in a similar predicament. The more time passes, the more we realize how much we've lost with the Patira of Rabbi Sacks. So remarkable was his impact. But I'd like to share with you something that Rabbi Sacks himself wrote about the passing of his own father. It's in his book, Celebrating Life. He says the following: "I took his loss badly. For 2 years, my world fell apart. I could not read, write, or concentrate. I felt his absence daily. Then it happened. How it happened, I cannot say. Perhaps it was simply an awareness that grew over time. I found comfort. I thought that he was not there. Then I realized he was. Something of him lived on in me. I could still hear him, see him, turn to him for advice, knowing what he would say. I could forgive him for some of the things that he said which had hurt, and know that he forgave me for things that I said that hurt. I knew that the people who change our lives do not die. They live on in us as we live on in our children. That is as much of mortality as we will ever know this side of the grave, and it is enough." In his piece in this week's Jewish Chronicle, Rabbi Moshe Friedman writes, quoting a verse from Daniel, "Those who teach righteousness to the multitude will shine like the stars forever." One explanation is that the starlight we see on a clear night has taken millions of years to reach our eyes. For all we know, the star we gaze at might well have died eons ago, yet their light continues to shine long after they have gone. Similarly, the influence a teacher has on their students continues long after they have left this world. While we feel utterly bereft at our loss, Rabbi Sacks' vast legacy will continue to shine in our hearts and the minds and the souls of everyone he touched for generations to come. Friends, as I say, we have a number of speakers this evening, and I'd ask each of the speakers if they could keep themselves please to a maximum of 10 minutes, for everyone who wants to be able to contribute this evening can do so. I'm delighted to call on our first speaker this evening, Rabbi Plancey. Now, Rabbi Plancey was a member of the Chief Rabbi Sacks' cabinet for a number of years. Rabbi Plancey, it's over to you.
Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. Friends all, I've known Jonathan, and that's how I called him, for many, many years, even long before he became Chief Rabbi. Tonight I want to share with you some thoughts. I was chairman of the Rabbinical Council in 1987 for 7 years, and during that period of time, Jonathan Sacks was appointed as the Chief Rabbi. And I was delighted because the very first Shabbos he spent as the appointed Chief Rabbi was in Boreham Wood, in this our community. And oh boy, did we have a wonderful celebration with him. He spent many other Shabbos with us, and his kindness was something very, very special in the way he treated everybody, the way he spoke. You know, I could remember he came with us as a guest to Bournemouth. Many of the older members of the community will remember. And I remember at the hotel, the next morning we were told the story. His kindness was something special. He would never shout or scream and insult anybody. He phoned down to the reception. He said, "I'd like to tell you, I've got hot and cold water running in my bedroom." Oh, they said, "We're delighted. Are you happy with it?" He said, "No, it's coming through the ceiling." He didn't start screaming. He went down and they changed his room. And boy, did we have an evening, because Motzei Shabbos, we had a kumsitz where everybody sat around. He told stories. He sang. It was unbelievable. A weekend we've never, ever forgotten. Many of you might not even know this, but my friendship goes back longer than anybody knows. Because, you know, I was the rabbi in Luton for 4 years. You won't believe this, but Jonathan Sachs followed me to Luton. And he said that was an experience he would never forget either. So I've got this friendship. I was appointed by Jonathan Sachs to become a member of his cabinet. And this was for interfaith. And there I learned something. He became the rabbi's rabbi. He asked me to do things I thought in a month of Sundays he would never have invited anybody to do. He sent me to India to give a paper. It was an amazing thing. I gave a paper for him, and he asked me to give a paper for the chief rabbi of Israel as well on missionary activities. That paper he wrote was magnificent. He then sent me off to Rome to meet with the Pope. Now, I thought he would want to go there. He had the opportunity later, but he said, no, he said, this is your position and you will go. This Menschlichkeit was something that shone through. And I'd like to describe him in the following way. Every human being is a world by themselves. And every world is dependent on 3 foundations: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilus Chasodim. The Torah we all know. Everybody's read about the intellectual activities in everything that he wrote, the way he spoke in shuls and the lectures he gave. I even remember he told me they built a stage which rotated for Lubavitch in America when he went to all the shlichim, thousands of them there, and they came back. The report was just an amazing thing. And even when I was in America, I went to the bookshop. The window was massive, and in it was a photograph. He's coming shortly. Make sure you've bought his book. He was considered like a king there. I won't say a god because he wasn't chas v'shalom, but he is certainly respected and loved as a king, as one of the greatest leaders in the world today. His sensitivity was also something special, and you've read about it, where people complained, some of the other people I won't mention, about one of his books. What did he do? He didn't go mad. He rewrote the paragraphs because that was his Menschlichkeit. And I want to tell you, it's interesting because today in the Sedra, when Eliezer was sent to find a wife for Isaac, for Yitzchak, he went away. He could have found anybody. There was no Jews at that time. And the answer is Abraham was looking for a mensch, somebody with virtue, somebody with midot. When Jonathan Sachs became chief rabbi, I remember we invited as the chair, my wife and I, all the other candidates. And I can tell you to this day, Jonathan stood head and shoulders over in each and every one of them. His Torah was something outstanding. We went on a mission to Israel, the rabbis, and we went to Gush Etzion to the yeshiva, where Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, please asked him, give a drosha, speak to the Bochli, speak to everybody. And I still remember it so clear, and my memory's not as good as it was. He spoke about the 5th son, and boy, did he really speak beautifully. Rabbi Chapper, you mentioned about his father and the loss of his father. I can remember going to see him sitting Shiva. He was so distraught, but the one thing he tried to do the whole time was to give comfort and solace to his mother and to give her the greatest support that was physically possible. So here we have the Torah, one foundation which he built for himself. Avodah is prayer. The second section, he rewrote the Siddur, not the words, but the translation, the interpretation, the Machzorim. He did so many wonderful things, the Haggadah, which I still have, and I read it regularly. Something unbelievable, but Avodah also refers to service to the community. He was dedicated to give service to the community. But the most important thing I found was his Gemilut Chasadim, his care, his love, and his kindness. Miriam and I were invited on many occasions to his home for dinner. And there I want to tell you, and it's something special, we met John Major, we met the Archbishop. He even sent me to go to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the latest one, to his induction. He wasn't afraid. He gave the rabbis the greatest encouragement, the greatest incentive. Everything was there. Kibbut Av Aim he had there. Hachnosas Orchim he had there. Bikar Cholim he would visit and he would phone. He was truly a partner in all the leadership of Anglo-Jewry with each and every one of us. 15 years in interfaith taught me a lot. I don't know whether he was trying to get rid of me, but he sent me to India, to the Swamiji, and there I can tell you that was about missionary activity, which he was really, really against, and I had to give it. I came home. He then sent me to Rome. He sent me to the royal family on almost every year for years, for 15 years, to the Commonwealth Day, to all the receptions, and finally, we were together at the royal wedding. That was the sort of chief rabbi we had, a man who was prepared to share with everybody, particularly his colleagues. He was prepared to care for everybody. Welfare meant so much to him. If he wasn't well, we could phone him. If we weren't well, he would phone us. I tell you tonight, I say this with an honest, with an open heart and a full heart. I'm going to miss him. I read the Chronicle this weekend for the first time. I spoilt my Shabbos. I read the Chronicle. I read all the other papers. But you know what upset me was looking at his photograph the whole time. He's going to be like Rashi, like Tosfos, like the great rabbis. I'm not going to say Jonathan Sacks said. It will be Jonathan Sacks says. Because a tzaddik, a fila b'misosom nikroim chaim, great people, even in their lifetime, are considered, even in their death, are considered to be alive. His books, his work, his inspiration, his example will truly be something we will always remember. And can I conclude by saying that this was a partnership that he had with his wife as well. Elaine was something special. We had one Shabbos, he came, he had been out at the dentist all day and he was in terrible pain. He apologized and he said, Elaine will look after everybody. We had a full table of guests. And I want to tell you, it was just an amazing Shabbos we'll never forget. She could also, and she was a very modest and a shy woman, she could also have been called truly the real Chief Rebbetzen. So Elaine, to you, to your children, to Jonathan's brothers and to the family, I wish them all arichas yomim. It's going to be a long time before we're going to get over this. In my lifetime, I've seen 3 chief rabbis go, and each chief rabbi, Chief Rabbi Brody, Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz, and now Chief Rabbi Sachs, and each and every one of them left an indelible impression on me. And I have carried on trying to follow the examples that each and every one of them have taught me. So friends, the community has lost a living example, but we still have so much to copy and to follow. Elaine, to you and all your family, we wish you arichas yomim, and the greeting Hamokim Yenachem Eschem, B'Soch Sheravel Yitziyim V'Yerushalayim. May the Almighty comfort you all, together with those who are mourning for Zion and Jerusalem. And Jonathan, Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, we ask you to be a Melech Yosher, an intercedent on behalf of Klal Yisrael. You were also a wonderful leader for the whole of society. So intercede on everybody's behalf. Get rid of this pandemic and let's all be able to live in health and in happiness. And please God will be able to celebrate with the rest of your family for many years, Simcha, but always you will be there in our memory and in our hearts. Shavua Tov.
Amen, amen. Rabbi Plancey, thank you so much for sharing those beautiful words and very personal thoughts and memories of Rabbi Sacks. Now I'd like to invite Lord Polak to speak. He will know Rabbi Sacks for many different avenues, particularly from his seat in the House of Lords and being the president of the Conservative Friends of Israel. Stuart, over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Chapper. And let me begin by saying I agree with Rabbi Plancey. Through his works, through his books, Rabbi Sacks will live on. You know, social media has so many problems with it, as we all are aware, but in this case, social media is a blessing. The YouTube, the weekly talks, we've got it. They're with us. They will be with us for as long as we want them to be with us, and we're very lucky. I actually first met Rabbi Sacks in the 1980s when I was education director of the Board of Deputies, and Rabbi Plancey talked of missionaries a couple of times. Well, it was at a particular meeting in the 1980s that I had with Rabbi Sacks. Just the two of us were meeting with an organization called the Church's Mission Amongst the Jews. These were a group of people in the Anglican Church who were very clear about what they wanted to do was to convert Jews. The meeting was called because we were, as a community, rightly concerned about the Jews for Jesus. So we're just coming in. It's an Americanism that was just arriving in our shores. And it was left to me and Rabbi Sachs, young rabbi in the 1980s, to have the meeting with them. And there's something I learned from him from that day that has always stuck with me, but it was just how his mind worked, how brilliant he was. You see, we were sitting around the table and we were trying to encourage these people not to almost leave us alone. And I thought, being sort of a young whippersnapper, that I was quite bright and quite clever. And I said, you know something, church leaders, I said, we have a faith, we have a religion, the 250 or 300,000 Jews there are here. I said, when you filled your churches with 50 million people, then come for us. Rabbi Sachs was far cleverer. And he looked at the guys and he looked at them and he said to them, you know, we as Jews, you as Christians, he said, we're all waiting together for the Messiah, the Mashiach, to come. You as Christians are waiting for him to return. We as Jews are praying for the day that he will come. So, you know, actually, we should be holding hands together. We should be praying, and we should just hope and pray and hope that the Messiah will come. And then he stopped and he looked at them and he said, and when he does come, he said, we'll ask him one question. Are you here for the first time or the second? So even in a really tense meeting, his brilliance shone through that he was even able to make a small joke. And then Rabbi Plancey talked of the Bournemouth weekend, which I remember. I'm not sure that Rabbi Plancey, I agree that it was only the older members of the community will remember. Hopefully we're not that old yet, but the Bournemouth weekend was very special because it just happened that Rabbi Sachs had agreed to come, 70 odd families, and it was once he'd agreed to come, then it was announced he was going to be chief rabbi. It was an opportunity for him to sit with the community, and it was something that I know those of us who were there and the rabbi talked about it, we cherished that. But let me jump to the real thing that I want to say, which is about his leadership and how he was respected right across the world. I was going to say the community, the world. In the Lords on Monday of this week, when they always sadly announced a death, members of the Lords from all different parties, non-Jewish people, throughout the debates on Monday, prefaced their remarks and talked about Rabbi Sachs. It is highly, highly unusual. Normally something will be said and gone, but people across the house were talking about. And then, for those, I'm sure many saw it, I mean, for the Prime Minister to begin Prime Minister's questions and talk about the contribution of Rabbi Sachs to British society, again, is mightily unusual. And that was the respect that he and the people had for him. Whenever he spoke in the House of Lords, there was a pin drop. He would speak with moral clarity and would only do it seldom. But when he did, everybody listened. And we saw the letter from Prince Charles. I mean, the amount of work that Rabbi Sachs must have done around the community, around society, inside the royal family, inside government, none of us probably will ever know. But we now begin to understand, when you saw the letter sent by Prince Charles, this was really, really quite amazing. The personal encouragement he gave to people. Often, as I wrote in my own private letter from Charlotte and I to Elaine, it was a nod, it was a smile, it was a few words he would just encourage us to do. And I end in the way that I ended my letter to Elaine. I have the book Lessons in Leadership on my desk in my office at home, and you know, he'd written in it nice words, just half a dozen words to me. So bless you for all you do. That meant so much to me. It wasn't in the public domain, although I put it in the public domain now. But the point was, he just knew what to say at the right time to encourage people. But we were talking about leadership, and I turned, actually, when I was writing the letter to my Bar Mitzvah Sedra, just happened to turn to Shemini, and I quoted back the last short paragraph that Rabbi Sachs wrote about the Sedra of Shemini, and I share it with you now. The last paragraph read, "People do not become leaders because they are great. They become great because they're willing to serve as leaders. It does not matter that we think ourselves inadequate. So did Moses. So did Aaron. What matters is the willingness, when challenge calls, to say, Hineni, here I am." And I ended the letter saying, thank God. Rabbi Sachs always, whenever we needed it, whether it was tragedies in Israel, whether it was anti-Semitism here, or whether it was to enjoy occasions, Rabbi Sachs always said, Hineni, here I am. And as I end with how I began, we have his writings, we have his speeches, and they will live on. Thank you.
Stuart, thank you so much for sharing those words and thoughts with us. Now, delighted to ask Rabbi Gideon Sylvester, who is the United Synagogue Israel rabbi and also grew up in London, was inspired by Rabbi Sachs, to share his thoughts with us. Rabbi Sylvester.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Chapper, and it's lovely to be with you all in Bournemouth. Here it's rather late at night because we're 2 hours ahead, so I think I'm going to be brief, but I did write an article in today's Jerusalem Post, or Friday's Jerusalem Post, with some personal memories of my beloved teacher, an inspiration and friend, and I'll post them in the comments section, so if anyone's interested, you can take a look. Rabbi Sachs was a magnificent friend. He understood our frailties, he understood our doubts, he understood our questions, and in some ways I think that was part of his greatness as a rabbi. There are many rabbis who can talk about faith. There are a few who can talk about doubt and talk about it in a way which comes from a place of faith and understands people of faith who have deep and difficult questions. And it was that ability to understand and relate to people's frailties that I think was very special. I'm haunted by the question of whether we understood his frailties enough, because for a man of that brilliance, with so much going on in his mind, to spent so much time looking after what were sometimes our trivial questions and issues and politics. It was very gracious of him, and he did it with incredible generosity. I just want to share one thought about him, which occurred to me at the time of his retirement dinner. There was a big retirement dinner done for him in London. I wasn't able to be there. I was living in Israel. I'm living in Israel. But I remember seeing the videos of it. And I remember seeing the videos of 4 prime ministers, one after another, lining up to speak about Rabbi Sachs as a national treasure. And one after another, they mentioned how they'd read his books, they'd befriended him, they'd learnt from him, he'd inspired them. And then we had 4 archbishops, the Catholics and the Protestants and the present and the previous, and each one of them also spoke with that degree of love and respect and admiration for Rabbi Sachs. And then Daniel Finkelstein, who was my cub leader, but also editor of the Times, spoke about the fact that whenever he needed someone to give intelligent comment and fresh comment and new comment on the events of the day, he knew that he could always turn to Rabbi Sachs and he would always hear something brilliant and new and refreshing. And I think it was John Humphreys from the Today program spoke about how he's very busy in his studio. He has ministers and prime ministers to talk to every morning. So normally doesn't look up when a minister of religion comes into his office, into his studio, but when Rabbi Sachs came, he would always look up and listen very carefully because he knew he'd hear something very brilliant. And when I listened to those recordings, and of course, topped off by Prince Charles, whose beautiful letter appeared in the paper this week, I was reminded of a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, which says that at the end of time, the nations of the world will come to us and say, Rak am hacham v'navon hagoy hagadol hazeh. They'll talk about the fact that the Jewish people is an intelligent and thoughtful people whom they should and will now respect. The Rambam talks about it at length in the Guide for the Perplexed. We won't go into that now, but what I thought was so special about Rabbi Sachs was that he just gave me a little taste of what that means, of what it means that in Messianic times, people will point at the Jewish people and say, this is indeed a people worthy of love and respect. Because when the entire hierarchy of British society stood up and pointed at Rabbi Sachs and said, this is a national treasure, that for me was the most incredible Kiddush Hashem, and just a taste of what, please God, it will be like in Messianic times. I'd just like to thank the previous two speakers. I echo everything that they said, and my good wishes to everyone in Bournemouth and Elstree. Please God, you should all be safe and have good health, and we should see better times. And of course, as I've expressed personally, my love and condolences to the entire Sachs family. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi Sylvester. We really appreciate you joining us from Israel, understanding obviously the time difference with us. Keep well, lovely to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to now ask our next speaker, Stephen Levey, who knew Rabbi Sachs particularly through his work as a musical director, to share his personal thoughts.
Thank you. You can watch it yourself now, yes?
Thank you very much, Rabbi Chapper. It seems somebody else has got their mic on. Okay, it's gone now. At the end of last week, I jotted down some personal reflections, and here they are. Libraries always seem to fascinate us, whether it is a fictional library, as in Matt Haig's recent book, The Midnight Library, or Kolos Rose Safon's Cemetery of Lost Books, or in The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, or whether in real life. It was in such a real-life library that I found myself in spring 2009. I was visiting Rabbi Sachs in Hamilton Terrace, and as I entered, I heard, "Stephen!" I looked up, and there was Rabbi Sachs at the top of the stairs in his shirt sleeves. He called, "Come up. Have I ever shown you my upstairs library?" I proceeded upstairs, and he took me into a room, which he described as his little sanctuary. And there in front of me was a room full of books. He said, "Let me show you this book." And then he took a thin paperback book from the shelf. The book was called, "How Can We Keep From Singing?" Rabbi Sachs told me that he'd read the book and now he wanted me to have it. He told me to read it carefully and take in all what the author, Joan Oliver Goldsmith, had to say. He inscribed the book there and then to Stephen, who taught Anglo Jury to sing, with blessings and best wishes, Jonathan Sachs. When I arrived home later that day, I found that Rabbi Sachs had carefully annotated the book in his familiar pencil underlinings. I devoured the book, but one particular paragraph still resonates with me. He'd underlined the following words: "Always, always they ask you to give more concentration, more purity of sound, better line, finer adagio. They will ask you, and you will ask yourself, you will especially ask yourself what you are doing here after a hard day's work at your day job, when you don't feel that good anyway, that you don't feel that good anyway, and your spouse is mad at you, and your kids say you never get anything right, and there isn't enough money to pay the bills. Then suddenly it flows, a bar, a phrase, perhaps even a movement, and you are the physical instrument, something higher. Then you know again of creation's assignment to learn the notes, to find the music. The invisible instrument is the one instrument we must learn to play. Some years earlier, I found myself in another library, this time in Windsor Castle. The Shabbaton Choir and Rabbi Lionel Rosenfeld had been invited to an ecumenical evening where clerics from many different religions had gathered to discuss, among other things, the state of religion in the UK and how they could work together for the common good. Rabbi Sachs thought it would be a good idea to present a concert to this distinguished crowd. And how could we refuse him, or indeed miss an opportunity to sing in the hallowed halls of Windsor Castle? Rabbi Sachs would often repeat the story of how the whole room was singing Am Yisrael Chai. How could there be a greater show of unanimity than this, he would say. However, he would go on to say that within only a few days, fire had ripped through a major part of the castle, causing irreparable damage. I first met Rabbi Sachs at Jewish Youth Study Group Summer School at Carmel College in the 1970s. Little did I think that I would be invited to conduct the Shabbaton Choir together with Chazan Simon Hass and then Chazan Lionel Rosenfeld at his service of induction on the 1st September 1991. This service started a period of nearly 30 years where I would have the privilege of being the musical director of the Shabbaton Choir and working alongside Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Sachs and Elaine accompanied Rabbi Lionel, Chazanim Shimon Kramer and Johnny Turgle, and the Shabbaton Choir on 8 of our 11 Solidarity Through Song missions to Israel. We traveled with Rabbi Sachs on 2 occasions to Los Angeles, and we participated in many moving Yom HaShoah commemorations, which were his brainchild. We were privileged to sing at his retirement event at the Barbican, where a choir of 300 school children, alongside Lionel, Shimon, and Johnny, sang my new composition, Anim Zemirot, in honor of Rabbi Sachs. We also sang at the gala dinner to celebrate Rabbi Sachs in front of Prince Charles, and more recently at the prestigious Templeton Prize Award ceremony. It was always a huge thrill to invite Rabbi Sachs onto the stage to sing with us, and he would never shy away from singing Oseh Shalom. It never fails to amaze me how Rabbi Sachs could adapt himself to any audience. On our Solidarity Through Song missions, he could be speaking at a hospital, then a children's facility, to those wounded in terrorist action, and to those in an old age home, to the young and to the old. Rabbi Sachs always had the perfect words. I remember the JFS students studying in Israel at Yamin Ord, who came to spend Shabbat with us on one of those missions, and seeing how they were mesmerized by Rabbi Sachs during a Kumzitz Udash Lishit. No one wanted Shabbat to go out. But of all the things we did together, it would be the annual choral slichot services that stick out most in my mind. How we waited each year in anticipation for what he was about to say, and how we clung onto every word, so wanting to be inspired and never being disappointed. How fortunate we were, and how I will miss those very personal moments. In what would turn out to be his last choral slichot service at the Hampstead Synagogue in 2019, he came, as he always would do, to talk to the choir beforehand. At this final slichot, he told us the following story. The story is about Yitzhak Perlman, the famous virtuoso violinist. Yitzhak plays his violin sitting in a wheelchair, having suffered from polio as a child, therefore depriving him of his mobility. At one particular concert, he was playing as a soloist in a certain violin concerto, and early on in the performance, a string snapped on his violin. Everyone expected him to send for a new violin, but with an extraordinary feat of virtuosity, He completed the concerto on 3 strings, an unbelievably difficult thing to do. At the end of the concert, the audience gave him a standing ovation, but they wanted to know why he had done this. Why had he simply not just changed the violin? Yitzhak reluctantly wheeled his chair into the middle of the stage, and this is what he said: "It is our task to make music with what remains." Rabbi Sachs then went on to give me a message for life. He said, "It doesn't matter how hard things get. It is our duty to make music, whatever the circumstances." The message can resonate in many different ways, but for me, it is something which is central to my own raison d'etre on life. From the early days, he would encourage me to compose music. On our first mission to Israel in 2003, after the suicide bombing on Seder night in the Park Hotel Netanya, I composed for Hi She'amda, and later Bilvavi, following the very sad death of Yoni Jesna. Rabbi Sachs said that this is what Yitzhak Perlman meant, to make music out of what remains. After we recorded Oseh Shalom in 2008, Rabbi Sachs would always try to include reference to it in what he was talking about, and of course, give the latest tally of its hits on YouTube. He was not shy to offer advice on what I'd composed, and neither was he shy in his commendation. I treasure all those conversations with him and feel privileged to be the recipient of his wisdom. Even the conversation one breakfast in Israel, when my wife and I were treated to a whistle-stop talk on the philosophy of Plato. Everyone knows Rabbi Sachs' famous saying, "Words are the language of the mind, but music is the language of the soul." We saw no better example of this than when we were in Israel on our Solidarity Through Song missions, where we experienced how music broke down all barriers. But it is another quote from Rabbi Sachs that I would like to end with. He says, "Faith is more like music than science. Science analyzes and music integrates. And as music connects note to note, so faith connects episode to episode, life to life, age to age, in a timeless melody that breaks into time. God is the composer and librettist. We are each called on to be voices in the choir, singers of God's song. Faith teaches us to hear the music beneath the noise. Yeh zichro baruch." Thank you.
Stephen, thank you so much, and for sharing that, one of Rabbi Sachs's so impactful stories. Thank you so much again. Now delighted to call on Rebbetzen Emma Taylor to share her personal thoughts as well.
Thank you. It's very hard to follow all these beautiful tributes, but before I get to what I actually prepared, just something that Rabbi Plancey said just reminded me, we were very lucky to actually live in the flat that Rabbi Sachs and Lady Elaine lived in Western Marble Arch, and we often hosted many American tourists throughout our 6 years there. And whenever we mentioned, the conversation often happened to go on to Rabbi Sachs, as this was his shul. And whenever we mentioned that the dining room table that we were sitting at was his dining room table, and the chairs we're sitting on were his chairs, the look of awe on these guests' face was unbelievable. He was like a celebrity in their eyes. So to the whole world, the respect that people had for him was incredible. And we feel very honored, both Sam and myself, that we knew him personally. So I just put together something that I sent out yesterday in my meaningful moment. So anyone that's heard it already, I apologize, but this is just some personal reflections. So like everybody, I'm sure, I have been trying to process the loss of Rabbi Sachs since hearing of his passing last week. A man whose brilliant mind inspired so many and whose advocacy for the Jewish people and the state of Israel was unprecedented. Sam and I feel very honored to have known Rabbi Sachs on a very personal level. He often spending the Yomim Noraim with us in Western Marble Arch, as well as many other Shabbatot throughout our 6 years at the shul. He gave us personal advice, and he always asked after the welfare of us and our children. He even joked with me once that we were both using WhatsApp groups to send out our messages, having read about my meaningful moment I send out in the shul newsletter. I have many, many fond memories, and as Rabbi Rosenfeld stated in his Hesped, when you heard him speak in shul, you felt as if you were witnessing a historic event. We were so very privileged. My favorite memory, however, was when we were fortunate enough to spend Shabbat lunch with the Saxes and the Rosenfelds at a member of the shul's house. To be at such an intimate gathering with him and Lady Elaine was really an honor, and watching how his face literally lit up the room, and he became so enamored as he spoke of the chumash that he was working on, gave all of us such a feeling of enthusiasm and excitement for the depth and beauty of our heritage and our tradition. But on the way home, we were walking through Regent's Park, and I realized that I couldn't see Yishai, our eldest son, who was about 8 at the time. We later understood that Yishai decided to walk ahead of us with his friends, as he called them, Lionel and Jonathan, as this was what they were calling each other. After explaining to him about the importance of using both of their proper titles, Rabbi Rosenfeld and Lord Sachs, he told me that they were all the interesting things that they were discussing, such as politics, because Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party at the time, and how it ended off with Rabbi Sachs discussing his relationship with Tony Blair. How precious this memory is now, and how fortunate are we that we were all able to glean some of Rabbi Sachs's wisdom, even if it was from a distance. Rabbi Sachs, in his covenant and conversation on this week, or today's parsha, we read Chaye Sarah, points to a troublesome verse depicting the death of Avraham. The Torah says, then Avraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years. And Rabbi Sachs questions the serenity that seems to pervade this description of death. This is also a feature of the way that Sarah's death is described. She was 120 and 7, teaching us that all her years were equal in goodness. But how can that be? Both Avraham and Sarah's life was full of challenges and turmoil. They had to wait many, many years for a child, suffer through famine, as well as the 10 tests that Avraham had to struggle through. How can this all be perceived as good? Yet Rabbi Sachs explains the parsha answers this question when it describes how Avraham is told to look out at the land, as one day it will belong to his people. Yes, he didn't see this promise fulfilled in his lifetime, and yes, he did not see his descendants become as many of the stars as the stars in the sky. But he saw the beginning of his dream through the marriage of his beloved son Yitzchak. We are not sent here to complete the job, but to take the initial step. And this quote actually has been said many times by many people. I'm now going to quote directly from his covenant and conversation. Rabbi Sachs says, to be happy does not mean that you have everything you want or everything you were promised. It means simply to have done what you were called on to do, to have made a beginning and then to have passed on the baton to the next generation. The righteous, even in death, it says in Brachot, are regarded as though they were still alive, because the righteous leave a living trace in those who come after them. That was enough for Avraham and Sarah, and it must be enough for us. Rabbi Sachs, in his pages and pages of Torah thought that he created, has now passed on the baton to all of us to live up to the ideals that he lived by. And we have to take on the challenge that he has left to all of us. And like everyone, I want to send my condolences to the whole family and say really how much we're going to miss him and his Torah thoughts.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Sam Taylor, for sharing those ideas with us. Now I'm going to call on Barry Shaw, who is a United Synagogue trustee and also a former chairman of the BES, to share some memories of Rabbi Sachs' connection to Bournemouth Shul.
Thank you, Rabbi Chapper, Rabbi Plancey, and everybody, Shavua Tov. Being the last speaker has inevitably led to some of the things I was planning to say already having been alluded to. But in reminiscing and thinking back to some of the visits Rabbi Sachs made to Boreham Wood, much mention's already been made of his joining us as the sort of scholar in residence on our memorable Bournemouth trip, of which there were 3 or 4 weekends in the early 1990s, late 80s, early 90s. But I also remember very well, he came for a Shabbat also while he was chief rabbi-elect. And also most memorably, I recall in about 1999, he came for a Shabbat in the community with Rabbi Lionel Rosenfeld and the Shabbaton choir led by Stephen. And we had the most memorable Shabbat. I think of all the years I've been in the community, probably the most memorable Shabbat I remember, where we had a magnificent Friday night, Shabbat morning with the chazan and the choir, and Rabbi Sachs spoke. We then had a communal lunch together where he spoke again. And then I think perhaps almost most memorably, we had a Sudah Shlishit at which a group of young members of the community, by which I mean teenagers around 18 or so, formed a panel and did a Q&A with Rabbi Sachs, where he answered all of their questions most beautifully. That was a truly memorable Shabbat when he was here. He also gave various shiurim over the years. There was a time, I think, when there was a Pesach shiur, which went around various communities over the years by Rabbi Sachs, and I think a pre-Rosh Hashanah shiur that went around various communities over the years. And both of those he gave in Boreham Wood at different times. And I also remember him coming for a memorable afternoon for the induction of Rabbi Brower, which was also one of his visits here at a time when he'd been several times within a few months. There may be others. I'm sure many people watching and listening will have other memories of his coming to Boreham Wood and Elstree Synagogue for a visit, which haven't been mentioned this evening. It would be great if you could maybe contribute those afterwards. He was also a very hugely committed member and advocate of the United Synagogue and everything it stood for. As you probably know, this year the United Synagogue has celebrated its 150th anniversary. 25 years ago, not long after he had become chief rabbi, we celebrated our 125th anniversary, which he commemorated by bringing out a book all about the United Synagogue and its ethos, called Community of Faith, a copy of which I have here, and in which he wrote the following about the United Synagogue, of which we in Boreham Wood are a member, but this perhaps also epitomizes his view of Am Yisrael, of the whole people of Israel, and how we should all relate to one another and to the concept of achdut, to unity amongst the Jewish people. He said, or he wrote, the United Synagogue was to provide, within the parameters of Jewish law and practice, a spiritual home for all Jews who chose to enter its gates, regardless of their personal commitments or levels of religious observance. It offered, and still offers, a context of Jewish belonging to the least and most observant alike. That, in the eyes of its admirers, is its primary virtue. I hope that still remains the case today, both within the United Synagogue and also certainly within Boreham Wood and Elstree Synagogue over many years. My personal recollections of Rabbi Sachs also go back many years. He was a good friend of my older brother, with whom he was a contemporary. And like Stephen, I also came across him at Jewish Youth Study Group, summer and winter schools, where he was a lecturer. And even then, he was already renowned for being an outstanding speaker. I remember one Shabbat morning, he gave a sermon to all of us in the famous Carmel College Shul, which some of you may be familiar with. And it was an outstanding sermon, and everyone was wowed by what he had said. At the end of the service, I happened to wander up. I was locking up the Aron Kodesh, I think, and I looked on the pulpit, and on the pulpit were his notes. And for that outstanding sermon, for which he'd spoken for about 15 minutes, there were 6 words on the piece of paper, 6 triggers, 6 words from which he gave, without any further notes, this most outstanding sermon to a group of teenagers. Later on, not long after that at all, I was in fact one of his congregants in his first position as the rabbi of Golders Green Shul, Dunstan Road, when he must have been still then in his 20s still. And even then, as I said, he already had a reputation for being an outstanding speaker. So much so that one year he gave the Shabbat Shuvah drasha, and the shul was packed. This was at Mincha, and people come from far and wide throughout Golders Green, including in particular one visitor who came to hear him, who was Chief Rabbi Jacobowitz. So that gives you an idea of his reputation already, Rabbi Sachs, that the then Chief Rabbi had come to hear him, Rabbi Sachs, give a Shabbat Shuvah drasha. He was already in those days very innovative and imaginative, wanting to develop Jewish education and Jewish identity in the community. He started what now has become commonplace, but in then was very innovative, namely a midweek adult education series where you had two choices of speaker, then a break, then another two choices, maybe a keynote speaker. When he started that in Dunstan Road, that was a new concept. It was innovative. He also set up a group of young rabbis called Yamin, which was to help develop education within the United Synagogue. And they produced a Pesach booklet called a Seder.
Barry, please unmute yourself.
Rabbi Plancey was a member of this group, and he was in fact the coordinator of this publication of a Seder guide by this group. In the introduction, Rabbi Sachs writes, and you can already see the way he was thinking and the leadership he was providing. Yamin is a group of young rabbis and ministers who have been meeting regularly for a while to try and break the spiritual deadlock in our mainstream synagogues. We come together to learn, share ideas, stimulate one another, and stop ourselves from becoming too set in our ways. We are united in our desire to communicate the sense of excitement that we feel in our Judaism. And that perhaps set the tone for his rabbinate and indeed his chief rabbinate. For me, Rabbi Sachs was a mentor because his hashkafa, his worldview, epitomized and brilliantly and eloquently articulated the brand of Judaism to which I subscribe and to which we as a United Synagogue subscribe. Call it modern Orthodox, centrist Judaism, whatever you like, the label doesn't matter. But he was one of the few rabbis who was so passionate about a Judaism that is Orthodox, yet outward looking, relating to society, and appreciative of what the secular world can offer us, but also what religion generally and Judaism in particular can offer the secular world and to the wider society and its moral standing, while yet retaining respect for all those who hold differing views. And his respect in the country has been well documented in the last week. But I over the lockdown period, I've read the autobiography of John Humphreys. I think it was Rabbi Sylvester who mentioned Rabbi Sachs on Thought for the Day, and that's been mentioned many times as well in the last week. John Humphreys was no fan of Thought for the Day. He thought a God slot didn't really have a place at 10 to 8 in the morning on a national radio station. But the one person he did respect and listen to and loved having in that slot was Rabbi Sachs. And he wrote the following in his autobiography. I wish every listener had been able to sit opposite Jonathan as I did while he was delivering those words. It was like watching a revivalist preacher, but without the histrionics and the nonsense. His passion and his belief are palpable. He frowns with concentration and sometimes with frustration, seemingly directed at the inadequacy of mere words to express what he believes. He clenches his fist, almost in anger at himself, because he feels that what he's saying is so important and he's not doing it justice. But of course he is. If I were forced to make the case for Thought for the Day in only 2 words, they would be Jonathan Sachs. On another occasion, John Humphreys interviewed Jonathan Sachs. And at the time, Rabbi Sachs said to him, he said to Rabbi Sachs what he hoped to get out of the interview. John Humphreys said, it's simple enough. All you've got to do is convert me, turn me into a religious Jew. Jonathan Sachs laid his hand on my arm and smiled rather forlornly. John, he said, I wouldn't dream of it. You've got enough problems already. I think that really summed up, first of all, Rabbi Sachs's humor, but also his place in society generally and within the Jewish world. As Rebbetzen Taylor alluded to, he wrote about Avraham and Sarah, and writing about Chaye Sarah, he asked the question why so many Pesukim are devoted to the 2 episodes of the Cave of Machpelah and finding a wife for Yitzchak. And he said, the point about it is that large promises that God made to Abraham, a land and countless children, become real through small beginnings. Leaders begin with an envisioned future, but they know there's a long journey. We can only reach it one act at a time, one day at a time. Abraham acquired only a single field and just one son who would continue the covenant, but he did not complain, and he died serene and satisfied because he had begun, and he left future generations something on which to build. Leaders see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality. I think certainly in the Jewish world, in Anglo-Jewry and beyond, Rabbi Sachs achieved immortality. And with all his writings and his broadcasts available on YouTube, we fortunately will never forget him and have the opportunity for his memory to live on. Thank you.
Barry, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, I'd like to ask Rabbi Finn to speak. Rabbi Finn.
Thank you, Rabbi Chapper. In truth, I've actually not written anything. I came here to listen. I've spent, like probably many people on this call, the last week scrolling through hundreds of posts from people I know, from people that I didn't even know existed, all of them saying the same thing, that Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzedek Livracha, was amazing. The way he impacted people, Jewish, non-Jewish, the way he interacted with young and old, the life lessons he taught through his interactions, through his behavior, through his conduct, the ever-presence of Lady Elaine throughout his life, working in partnership, showing how, as Rabbi Plancey was describing, it's important to work as part of a team. The inspiration he gave to young rabbis, young educators at the beginning of their career, many of whom have gone on to really impact the world themselves through what they're doing and what they're writing. And then even reading, like many of you over Shabbos, well, I read the Free Jewish Press, so the Jewish Weekly and the Jewish News, but the thing which jumped out was the letter from Prince Charles. It's crazy. The heir to the throne, Prince Charles, writing about a Jewish person impacting his life, the loss that he feels now that Rabbi Sachs is no longer here. How privileged we are to have lived with Rabbi Sachs. And I think that's the conclusion I've come to over the last week as I process this. Generations before us have had their rabbis. You know, I look very much to the writings of Rabbi Samson Hirsch, thinking how amazing it would have been to live at his time, to hear his Torah. And then I think, well, we had Rabbi Sachs. You have to go a long way back to find a rabbi of his quality, of his caliber, of his impact. We have his writings. We have his voice. We were taught his Torah, and his Torah is amazing. Speaks to us today and will continue speaking to us for the many, many years to come. How fortunate are we to have had Rabbi Sachs, to have been able to hear his voice in 100 years' time when people are reading his Sefarim, when people are sitting down at the table looking at his Haggadah, which I go to every year before Pesach for my inspiration, and they'll be thinking of him as a historical Rebbe, as a historical figure. We heard his voice. I remember the last 2 slichot that I got to hear him speak, both times having to fight a crowd to get in. The one which was happening the last night of him being chief rabbi, Stephen will be able to tell us how many people they had to send home. We got to hear Rabbi Sachs live. We got to ask him our questions. We got to hear his Torah at its most relevant for our lives, because he was writing for our generation, for our situation. How privileged are we? And so I'm coming to a position of thankfulness that I was alive at the same time as Rabbi Sachs. I got to hear Rabbi Sachs. I got to learn from Rabbi Sachs, whether in my smicha class, because as I mentioned on Facebook, he's one of the people who gave me smicha and would regularly come to the Meta Veil and give us insights into his life, into his Torah, into his philosophy. But each and every one of us, how privileged we were to have Rabbi Sachs and to be alive at the time of Rabbi Sachs. And that's what I'm taking with me. And that's what's giving me comfort. I think we should continue to learn his Torah and to preach his Torah and to make sure that his Torah influences us, impacts us in the way that it was and the way it shall always do. Like everybody, I wish his family a long life, but that there should be comfort knowing what an amazing man he was and what an amazing impact and what an amazing legacy he has left. Thank you.
My Finn, thank you so much for that very powerful idea. You're absolutely right. We should be so thankful to have lived during the time of Rabbi Sachs and to be able to learn and hear his voice alive. We're going to do something slightly different now. As you know, Rabbi Sachs said famously, there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. And Rabbi Sachs has left us with a tremendous wealth of wisdom. And two members of BES, Eddie Hammerman and Damien Shogger, have taken some of Rabbi Sachs's wisdom and they've set it to a contemporary music. And I'm just going to share a little bit with you, and then we'll share the link for people to see it more. It's called Everybody is Free to be Wise.
Wisdom is free, yet it's also the most expensive thing there is, because we tend to acquire it through failure or disappointment or grief. That's why we try to share our wisdom, so that others won't have to pay the price for it that we paid. These are some of the things Judaism has taught me about life, and I share them with you. Never try to be clever. Always try to be wise. Respect others, even if they disrespect you. Never seek publicity for what you do. If you deserve it, you'll receive it. If you don't, you'll be attacked. In any case, goodness never needs to draw attention to itself. When you do good to others, it's yourself, your conscience, and your self-respect that will be the beneficiary. The greatest gift of giving is the opportunity to give. In life, never take shortcuts. There is no success without effort, no achievement without hard work. Keep your distance from those who seek honor. Be respectful, but none of us is called on to be a looking glass for those in love with themselves. In everything you do, be mindful that
God sees all we do. There is no cheating God. When we try to deceive others, usually the only person we succeed in deceiving is ourselves. Be very slow indeed to judge others. If they are wrong, God will judge them, and if we are wrong, God will judge us. Greater by far than the love we receive is the love we give. It was once said of a great religious leader that he was a man who took God so seriously that he never felt the need to take himself seriously at all, and that is worth aspiring to.
I'm not sure if anyone was able to hear that. Hopefully you were. But just being shared in the chat facility now is the link to it, so you can listen to the rest yourself.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of the time, so we have a few more speakers. And I'd like to ask Jeremy Newmark, who is head of communications at the Office of Chief Rabbi, if he'd like to share some of his memories with us.
Thanks, Rabbi. I had the privilege of working for the chief, as we all used to know him and call him then, for about 6 years as his head of communications and his spokesperson. It was always an odd sort of job, because, you know, how do you function as spokesperson for possibly one of the most articulate and effective communicators in the world? And actually, a lot of the time, I found that that my role wasn't the traditional one where you would sort of write speeches and sort of set out communication scripts, but it was the opposite. He would write 95% of all of his own material. And, you know, often my job was to put big red or black lines through the stuff that he passionately wanted to say, but was likely to land him in trouble. Sometimes we got it wrong, sometimes we got it right. I was privileged to, you know, often sit at his side during the many regular meetings he had with royalty, and certainly two prime ministers, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Whenever he went to visit Downing Street in those days, it was an event. It wasn't just a case of seeing the Prime Minister. When word got out that the chief rabbi was in the building, officials, political advisors, everybody would clamour for just a minute or two of his time in the waiting room, just as he was due to go in or out of the Prime Minister's personal office. And then often in the latter days, the meetings took place in the flat upstairs. They would always include a review of current events. Prime Ministers were always keen to hear his take on global affairs and national affairs, but there would always be a large component of that meeting that effectively became a mini share. And Blair would always say to him, I'd like to use the next 20 minutes to study some Bible. And it was the most fascinating and awe-inspiring thing to see, you know, the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations effectively giving a 20-minute share in the heart of government in Downing Street. A few people have mentioned his slots on the on Thought for the Day as part of the Today programme on Radio 4. He took those so seriously, you know, a 3-minute national platform. He would often spend the entire day before those Radio 4 broadcasts working on the script with the BBC editor, ensuring it was absolutely right. Now, often the contributors to Thought for the Day would give their contribution down the line from a BBC radio car or an ISDN line, or as it was in those days, or from home. But the chief rabbi always insisted on going in to do these in person. And those of us in his office would often question him as to whether or not he really needed to get up so early on what was otherwise a quiet day, schlep into White City or Broadcasting House to sit in the studio. And he saw those Thought for the Day sessions as his own. He described it as, I have to be there. I have to see John. I have to be opposite John Humphreys when I do this. This is my opportunity to do my own bit of kiruv on John Humphreys. That's how he saw those sessions. And I think, as we heard from Barry earlier, they certainly had an impact, and perhaps they worked. I used to have, as part of my role, the task of doing a monthly briefing with the religion editors, the religion correspondents from the major national and broadcast news outlets. In those days, all the papers had religion editors. I don't think they do so much. And again, I used to compare notes with my counterparts in the offices of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. And I could never understand why they dreaded these meetings and saw them as really tough times, because there was so much love and affection for the chief rabbi from those religion editors that I had the easiest time in the world. In fact, often they would spend time commiserating with me and giving me tips to pass on to the chief rabbi on how he might get a better hearing in the media in his own community, which the non-Jewish religion correspondents from the national press, felt never gave him a fair hearing. And there are so many stories that have been told over Facebook, social media, traditional media over the past week, but there's still so many more yet to emerge and yet to be told. And I thought I'd just share briefly one or two that I think sum up his outlook on his role vis-a-vis articulating Jewish principle and the interests of the Jewish community to the wider world. I'll never forget what we always called the Kosovo episode. It was towards the tail end of the war in Kosovo, and a story emerged that was all over the Israeli press, but not really reported anywhere else, about how through the offices of ORT and the Jewish Agency, because all the schools had been closed in Kosovo, a delegation of Israeli youth leaders had been flown over by the IDF effectively to provide an education program in place of the schools. Chief was really struck by this, and also shocked and appalled that this wasn't covered anywhere in the mainstream media. And he became a dog with a bone between the teeth about the need to tell the world this amazing Kiddush Hashem, as he put it. So I was called into his study at Hamilton Terrace as his head of communications, Jeremy, as he did, and he asked me to do what he felt would be a very straightforward task. Would I arrange for his annual Rosh Hashanah broadcast that was due to be filmed the following month, to be filmed in the middle of a war zone in Kosovo, in order that he could involve the Israeli youth, these makeshift schools, and effectively publicize this Kiddush Hashem. He said, do you think it's possible? And I said, well, there may be one or two logistical issues, but let's try. And what was amazing was to see the length that the British establishment went to make this possible. The senior editors and production team of BBC Religious Broadcasting, for the first time in the history of the BBC, had to go and do a week-long war zone survival training in order for the BBC's insurance to cover them to undertake this trip. They said to me they would not have done it for anybody else, but for Jonathan Sacks, it was a sacrifice they were prepared to make. General Sir Michael Jackson, who was the head of NATO forces out in Kosovo at the time, was blown away by the fact that a British faith leader wanted to come, publicize the work that was going on there, but also to spend time individually with British troops, both senior and junior, and had put in a special request to meet with the Jewish servicemen in the field. We flew out that morning on the Queen's flight, which was quite an experience. And I was called in to speak to the captain, a very senior military officer, who said, in a very British military tone, we've had some kosher food arranged, but there's some presentational issues. Would the chief rabbi be prepared to have a vegetarian meal or something similar? And I sort of went to speak to him about the fact there was some embarrassment around the state of the kosher food. And he replied with a line that I'd heard him use many times before, which is that non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism. So when about half an hour later, the military figures who bring the food out on the Queen's flight with white gloves, silver service style, on silver trays with a dome on top, lifted up the dome, and a shriveled up plastic Hermolis meal appeared underneath it, he certainly wasn't complaining. The time he took out of filming that day to blow the shofar that he brought along for two Jewish servicemen was again just one of those mind-blowing moments. And we were accompanied during the course of that day by Reverend Jonathan Jennings, who at the time was the senior British military chaplain in Kosovo. And in one of those strange coincidences or twists of fate, when Rowan Williams became Archbishop of Canterbury, that same Reverend Jennings was appointed as a senior aide to the Archbishop. People may be aware that Rowan Williams was not necessarily seen or expected to be desperately friendly towards Israel or the Jewish community, but it was one of those strange quirks of fate that Rabbi Sacks already had a close relationship with him following that day in Kosovo. But briefly, what I'll remember most about sort of spending time with him every day, more time with my family for 5 or 6 years, was how he was in the build-up to the Yomim Noraim, to the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur period. He would spend the summer in isolation in the study upstairs that Stephen mentioned, with all of his books and his treadmill. As senior members of his staff, we would be allowed to see him and interrupt his writing once a week in order to take his views or get a steer from him on any critical issues of the day. And during that month, when he was in writing mode, as he called it, it was like a different person. There was a calmness, a serenity, what you'd call it, around him, a real aura of somebody who wasn't just writing a book, but who felt he was undertaking a task for greater purposes. It then sort of emerged at the start of September, and often when Rosh Hashanah came early, the choral slichot service would be one of his very first engagements. He would spend quite literally an entire week preparing his slichot sermon from scratch every time. And again, this would sort of put him in a very different frame of mind. There was a certain calmness and awe and sense of majesty. You really felt something special around him at that time of year. And finally, I've got so many fond memories of time spent traveling with him. I remember on many trips to the States, it was quite something to sit on a 9-hour flight next to Jonathan Sacks with his brain ticking when he wanted to talk, trying to stay awake and deal with conversations that ranged from nuclear physics to highfalutin philosophy. I remember our walks through Central Park in New York, where it was a struggle to keep up with him. I know that Johnny Lethbridge from CST, who's on this call, will certainly empathise with that. I remember him regularly giving his security officer the slip to get some quiet time to go out shopping and for a chat. But I also remember how there would be no visit to the States when he would not be flooded with people, senior American communal leaders and heads of synagogues and educational institutions trying to recruit him, trying to headhunt him away from the chief rabbinate. And there is no doubt that the job offers he received every time that he went to America would have dwarfed the chief rabbinate in terms of salary, would have certainly been a quiet life with grace and favor apartments over Central Park and so on. But not once was he distracted or tempted to go in that direction. I don't think British Jewry knew how close that they possibly were from losing him as an asset every time he visited the States, where they were desperate to bring him into their communal service. I remember the painstaking work that he did to improve the cause of women in the Jewish community, and particularly not just the stuff he did publicly like the Women's Review and so on, but the work he did quietly behind the scenes on Agunah. I remember when he sort of deployed me to work with Andrew Dismore MP for the best part of 6 months on steering the clauses through in the Divorce Religious Marriages Bill that would require a religious divorce to be concluded in parallel with a civil and secular divorce. I remember the work he did on one particular intractable Agunah case, a very high-profile case involving a young woman and a recalcitrant spouse, actually from the Sephardi community in this instance, and he cleared a week of his diary. He brought in top secular negotiators with no experience of Jewish life or the Jewish community to work with the different parties and their teams on this case. And when he sensed that there was a possibility of a resolution, he had a Beth Din convened, literally sitting on the lower floor of his houses without the knowledge of either participant, so that the moment he achieved agreement in that case, the divorce could be effected there and then, and there would be no chance of the recalcitrant spouse backtracking. There were other things that I saw caused him much personal agony and pain, particularly the sometimes humiliating criticism he had to absorb from the right and the left of our community. And he always handled that in public with the utmost dignity and respect, even when he was attacked over his book, The Dignity of Difference, as Rabbi Plancey said earlier. Many of us around him advised him not to make the changes to those critical paragraphs. But I'll never forget the thing that he said to me when he made the decision to do the minor rewrite. He said, "People out there know what I believe. They know what I stand for. I've always been open about it. The most important thing at this point is to survive to fight another day. And thank goodness he did, because had he not done so, Anglo Jewry could have been bereft of his leadership at a much earlier stage. So those are sort of my thoughts and memories of an incredibly special person and a huge loss, not just to our community, but the wider world.
Jeremy, thank you so much for providing us with those fascinating behind the scenes insights into Rabbi Sacks's life. I really appreciate that. And now it's the opportunity for you to share your own personal reflections and memories of Rabbi Sacks. So now as many people as possible to speak. I'll ask everyone please to keep them to 1 or 2 minutes long. Also, please feel free to use the chat facility to add anything you want to. If you want to speak, please put your hand up using the virtual hand up sign in the chat facility. The first person I'm going to call is Sam Franklin, who'd like to say a few words.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you, Rabbi Chapper. And to all of the speakers, I'd echo a number of the points that have been shared. Rabbi Sam Taylor spoke of the fame of the Chief Rabbi. Wherever we've traveled in the world, when people hear you're from the UK, they say, Lord Sacks, Chief Rabbi Sacks. And then they say, have you heard him speak? Yes. Have you ever met him? Yes. And we achieved cult-like status in places like Vietnam and the jungle in South America, because we'd happened to have shared a space with the late Chief Rabbi Lord Sacks. And so I wanted to share just a couple of insights, really, that for me were about the Chief Rabbi as a man, not really about the office. I was in Cambridge with the Chief Rabbi on a speaking tour. It was when I'd been working at the CST, and we travelled all around the country. We worked our way down to Nottingham, Manchester, Leeds, not in that order. And as we would leave one, the Chief Rabbi would smile at us and say, come on, guys, on to the next. And we were absolutely exhausted. And in each of those occasions, he gave a different sermon. The only people that were crossover between them were the security people and his staff. Yet he spoke for each of the audiences. He gave a personal address. And for me, when we were in Cambridge, right at the end of the tour, it was at a time when the Chief Rabbi was saying Kaddish, and people had got a minyan together, the students had got a minyan together, and they'd asked him to lead. And he's touching his pocket, and he realized he doesn't have his zt'l with him, and someone offered him a phone. He said, I'm sorry, I can't use that. The student looked a little bit embarrassed. He said, the text is too small. So someone showed him how to zoom in. He took the phone, gave them a little smile, and led the davening from the phone. I'm dating it slightly, but this wasn't the norm, people to use a phone for davening, but he was happy, in amongst the technology. The Chief Rabbi didn't need a zt'l or a phone to use the davening, to lead the davening, but wasn't willing to stand in front of a group of students and to show off. He wanted to be humble throughout. Back in 2011, just after Rosh Hashanah, I received what at the time I thought was a prank phone call from some friends at the time. And the phone call goes like that. Hello, Sam, it's Jonathan Sacks here. And I really, it took me a couple of minutes. I was convinced that someone was pranking me. The Chief Rabbi had heard that I was unwell, and he was calling to send his best wishes. I found out a couple of days later that my grandmother had phoned her friends to tell them that the Chief Rabbi had called her grandson. People were saying, why? She'd forgotten to tell them that I wasn't well, but was more excited that the Chief Rabbi had picked up the phone. He's just a traditional British Jew, but his brand permeated all of British Jewry. And Lionel Rosenfeld said in his eulogy that when you heard the Chief Rabbi speak, you thought he was speaking to you. And right at the beginning of 2012, in a Jewish Chronicle article that's not probably particularly well known or often referenced in relation to the Chief Rabbi, he talks about a book that he wrote at the time, and I couldn't remember the book. I had to look it up. But the book was by a photographer. The book's called Go With The Flow. And it was a book by a photographer who was battling cancer. And he wrote in the introduction to that, I went with the flow, which carried me through. I looked at the angel eyeball to eyeball. One of us blinked, and it wasn't me. I refused. And I just remember thinking at the time when I saw that on the front page of the Jewish Chronicle, sometimes you just read something and you think, yeah, this could be written directly for you. And I a bit like Lord Polak, I picked up the Chief Rabbi's zt'l on Monday, and looked what he wrote in it at the time. And it's, I don't often look at the front page to see what he wrote at the time, but he just wrote, "Dear Sam, may Hashem bless all you do." And knowing the context with which he shared it with me, I thought, was very powerful. And I always think back to that phone call. He didn't introduce himself as the chief rabbi. He didn't introduce himself as Lord Jonathan Sachs. It was just, "Hi, Sam, it's Jonathan Sachs here." Because, and you can read this all over Facebook and everything. It was all about him as an individual. I had the honor and privilege to speak at a friend's wedding, and I wanted some inspiration of what to say. This friend was heavily involved in the Jewish community and was in the security team for Lord Sachs, and for other people, worked in lots of Jewish other community organizations. So I wrote to a number of people asking for some ideas to share. I got excuses back, left, right, and center of why people couldn't share anything. I looked back just this evening exactly what was written in the email, and written back was an attachment with a beautiful message to read under the chuppah with a, "Hi Sam, I hope this is okay?" ? I mean, I hope this is okay from Lord Sachs. Of course it's okay. But even in that time, it was the ultimate humility. And he writes in that message there, in the trademark way, he starts, Elaine and I, as so often messages probably did start, and he speaks there just beautifully about love and companionship. And so, it was really pertinent as I watched the eulogies to hear particularly Lionel Rosenfeld talk about the great company of the two of them as a couple, Elaine and the late Chief Rabbi. And so, I'll just wrap up there by saying it's definitely, a loss for Anglo Jewry, and the name The Chief for me will only, a title that will only ever be associated with one great man.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you. Alex Grainger would like to speak.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Chapper. I'm so deeply saddened at the untimely passing of Rabbi Lord Sachs. It's very hard to speak after those wonderful tributes. I just wanted to briefly share a few of my thoughts. On a personal level, I feel so privileged to have had the opportunity to work for Rabbi Sachs for a few years, from 2010, as my capacity as a videographer, filming his eloquent Divrei Torah, seeing so many of his droshes. His words always inspired me and left me wanting to learn more. I will never forget that experience. I'm also thinking at this time of his office team, especially Joanna and Dan, who I also worked very closely with over those years. I know this must be a particularly difficult time for them also. I remember the first time I visited Rabbi Sachs's home at Hamilton Terrace to film him for the Covenant and Conversation series videos in 2010, and remember feeling excited and terrified at the first time. I was fairly young and inexperienced and had never been given an opportunity like this before. Rabbi Sachs came downstairs, welcomed me into his study, and made me feel at ease. From then on started our working relationship. He always made time to thank me, no matter how busy he was. I will always remember the kindness he showed me. Despite his busy work schedule, he made a video message to bless my newborn daughter. One time he left me a voicemail to wish me Shana Tova. I had to hear it a few times to believe it was him. He gave me a number of his books, which he inscribed as a gift. I remember visiting the Jewish Expo at Wembley, and I happened to be walking into the event with my family when the Chief Rabbi's car pulled up along with his entourage, and he made a detour to walk over to greet my late mother and make a fuss of me, which made her feel so proud. On one occasion, I remember getting a phone call while I was at my home in my flat in Hendon. The Chief Rabbi wanted to make an urgent address on video for something hot off the press and wanted to know if he could pop by to my flat in 30 minutes. I remember getting off the phone and shouting to my wife, "Louise, the Chief Rabbi is coming now. We need to tidy up quickly." We both got into gear, my wife frantically hoovering and putting things away, while I went about setting up a makeshift studio. I remember how exciting it was he came into my home, along with the whole security team. On Rabbi Sachs's last night as Chief Rabbi, I was filming the Slichot at Hampstead Shul that Rabbi Finn earlier mentioned, had queues of people outside that could not come in due to being at full capacity. And as he walked into the shul, the first thing he did was come over to me and give me a hug to thank me before he went up to speak. These are the moments I will remember the most. This was the kind of man that he was. It was an honor and privilege to have known him and had the opportunity to work for a chief rabbi. I still cannot believe it and have to remind myself sometimes. World Jewry, and indeed all of humanity, has lost a giant of Torah whose teachings will be learnt for many generations to come. His greatness in both Torah and as a kind and charismatic man, as a real mensch, will always be in my thoughts. Wishing Lady Elaine, Josh, Dina, Gila, and the whole family a long life.
Alex, thank you so much for sharing those very personal and beautiful memories of Rabbi Sachs. And now I understand that Jonathan Arkush would like to say a few words. Jonathan, it's over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I just have two very brief anecdotes. 20 years ago, Hartsmere Jewish Primary School was established, and we are very proud of it in our community. And as Stuart Polak will remember, Rabbi Sachs, as chief rabbi, played a formative role in the 6 years of tough lobbying that took its establishment. And one evening he invited us to dinner at Hamilton Terrace, one of those dinners where you would expect to meet cabinet ministers and all sorts of other distinguished people. And that evening, the main guest was David Blunkett, the Secretary of State for Education, just by coincidence, of course. Shortly afterwards, the school won the approval from his ministry. Another anecdote is that while in my time at the Board of Deputies, I would spend a great deal of time with churches in interfaith events. I cannot tell you, because I've lost count of the number of times that senior bishops and other leaders of the Catholic and Protestant churches would come up to me and would say, "You're so lucky. I wish we had your chief rabbi as our Archbishop of Canterbury." When I look back on Lord Sachs, I remember that when he spoke, whether it was on Thought for the Day, in the House of Lords, on Newsnight, or giving his TED talk, our community stood taller because he gave it luster. We have lost a truly great man, and it's been a very sad time. But with Rabbi Finn, I think we should have the enduring thought to give thanks for his life. Partly because of him, the phrase, "May his memory be a blessing," used by the Prime Minister and used by Prince Charles, as passing into the English vernacular. I think we can be confident that the memory of Lord Sachs will be a blessing, not for our community alone, not even for our country alone, but across the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, so much for those words and memories. Now it's got on another Johnny. Johnny Lethbridge would like to say a few words. Johnny, it's over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Chapper. My name's been mentioned already, and to introduce myself, for over 5 years, I was one of Chief Rabbi Sachs's bodyguards. I worked for him full time. In addition to that, I was with him for over 14 years as a voluntary member of CST that used to protect him. And all I can do is echo everything that's been said, because on most of the stories you've heard, I was either there with him or certainly know someone that was. I'm trying to relate something back to Boreham Wood. There are a few occasions I can remember. Today, just a few months ago, even my son started at Yavna College in his first year there. And every time I walk into that school, when we go to the shul there, I see the stone on the left, the foundation stone that was laid. I think it was 2006. I recall that. I was with Chief Rabbi then, and I remember it being a cold winter's day, I think in March, and I think there was still snow on the ground. And we stood in what was just some effectively wasteland with a few metal beams up, which is now the dining hall at Yavna College. And he laid that stone. And every day I go into that building, whether it's to go to shul, whether it's with my son, or sometimes at CST, we use it for training. I see that and I'm reminded of everything he did in this community. Right at the beginning of tonight's tribute, I heard Rabbi Plancey speak of the many dinners he came, and I'd totally forgotten, but I remember back in around 2005, Rabbi Plancey attended a dinner at the Chief Rabbi's house with the then Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Ian Blair. There were some other great and goods of the Jewish community, including my chief exec of the time from CFT, Richard Benson, and our chairman, Gerald Ronson. So an evening of quite important people, but obviously the chief rabbi and Rabbi Plancey being the most important people. And what I didn't know was when Rabbi Plancey walked into the house, and I found this on the CCTV about an hour or so later, as he stepped through the door, he accidentally pushed the panic button to the special alarm system we had in the house that triggered an immediate response. Now, if any of you have ever done that by accident in your own house, normally what occurs is a police car will turn up and you'll get a knock on the door. But when you're at the chief rabbi's house and effectively their boss, the commissioner and the Met Police is inside, I'm sitting there because it's a silent alarm. I'm unaware and I'm just watching CCTV cameras when all of a sudden I see around 6 to 8 armed police officers in full SAS style gear coming in a pincer movement towards the front door of the house with their guns raised. And I quietly opened the door with my hands raised and I went, "What's going on?" And they went, "You've triggered the panic alarm." And I went, "No, I haven't." And I looked down to my left and there's the alarm showing red. And I went, "Someone's knocked it." And they had to come in, go into the house to check that the chief rabbi and all the guests were okay. Everything was fine, of course, and they left with their smiles on their faces. But there have been so many personal tributes, and I was able to call him a friend. He was there, as I was for him, at his happiest times. I was there when he received his knighthood. I was there seconds after his daughter had told him they'd just got engaged, his youngest daughter. But he was there for me. On my saddest day, he attended and gave the eulogy at my own mother's Levey, which is something I and my family will never forget. And as has also been mentioned, it wasn't just him turning up. It was Lady Sachs was with him. And the calls I received afterwards that my family members received from him, from Lady Sachs, meant more to me than anything. But finally, the thing I remember the most was actually when I'd left his team. It was in 2009, in the February, just after Shabbat. My son was born, our second child. And I put a message out, and one of my colleagues received that message, was with Chief Rabbi at that moment. And I was in the delivery suite holding my baby, and my phone was going mad with phone calls. And I just let them ring because I couldn't answer them. And in those days, we still carried the old-fashioned pagers, where you would leave a voice message, it was translated and sent to you like a text message today. And we had a call sign, as we called it, a code word for the Chief Rabbi. His name was Victor Charlie. It's a historic thing that goes back many, many years. And my pager goes off, and holding my child in one hand, I pull my pager out and I just see in this message, and it reads, "Mazel tov, all our love and wishes, Elaine and Victor Charlie." And that was the type of person he was. He knew what to say. There's a few words at the right time. And it was the greatest privilege and honor of my life, listening to all of you. And just I will testify to what Jeremy said. Today, when I go out shopping or walking with my family, they always shouting at me to slow down. When you walk behind a chief rabbi for so many years, you walk very quickly. So it was an honor. And thank you so much for tonight and for allowing me to speak, Rabbi Chapper.
Jonny, thank you so much for sharing again those very personal and insightful behind the scenes insights into the man and the institution of what was Rabbi Sachs. Now, anybody else would like to say a few words before we wrap up the evening? Okay, I've got Daniel. Daniel, if you just unmute yourself, we can't hear you.
You should be able to hear me now.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
So, like many people, I was very privileged to attend a Pesach program where Rabbi Lord Sachs zt'l was the scholar in residence, and a great many people would attend these. In particular, there was a very big interest, as we've remarked, from Americans who did see him as a celebrity. But I remember speaking to him during this time, and I remember on one specific occasion, because I knew that he had a particular interest in Hebrew and language generally, and I also was studying Hebrew at the time, that I showed him a book that I'd got all about Hebrew idioms. And he said to me, "Where did you get that book?" I said, "I got it from the nearby Steimatsky." So a few days later, I saw him in the queue for the kugel or for whatever it was, and he said to me, "I bought the book." And that for me spoke to a very, very special quality that a number of people have mentioned in the Hespedim, that not only was he such a preeminent teacher to us, he was also somebody who was always seeking to learn about ideas and hear from ideas that others were considering. And when he had heard about a book which sounded interesting, he went out and bought that book. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Daniel, for sharing that memory with us. Thank you. Now I'd like to call on Rabbi Taylor, who's going to speak, and then we'll recite the Askara. Rabbi Taylor.
Thank you, Rabbi Chapper. Thank you. Every time one heard a speech from Rabbi Lord Sachs, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, one was able to sense malchus, true kingship, and royalty in this world. At the beginning of this week's Sedra, the Hittites recognized Avraham Avinu as being a Nasi Elokim Atah B'tochenu, as being a prince of God in their midst. Rabbi Lord Sachs was the same for us, a prince of God in our midst, God's ambassador in this world. But this was the case not just for Anglo Jewry and not just for world Jewry, but indeed it was the case for humanity as a whole. As Prince Charles said a few days ago, the death of Rabbi Lord Sachs is the most profound loss to the Jewish community, to the nation, and to the world. One of my highlights of the high holidays at Western Marble Arch was listening to Rabbi Lord Sachs lead the Shacharit service as Chazan, which he did every year. Yes, his nusach was spot on, but more than that, you could sense by the way he led the service his kavanah, the feeling in his prayer, and his emunah, his faith in Hashem. These are sides of Rabbi Sachs which are not spoken about so much. Also, if it wouldn't be for Rabbi Sachs, I wouldn't be here in Bournemouth and Elstree. Last year, Parashat Chayei Sarah, Rabbi Sachs spent Shabbos at Western Marble Arch. He had a public conversation with Lord John Mann, and I spent Shabbos afternoon with him, 45 minutes upstairs in the gas flat, and I asked him his opinion. There's this job in Bournemouth, should I apply for it? What do you think? He said, "Sam, after Shabbos, you go straight away and apply for this position. It'd be great. It'd be a great shidduch. I'm telling you, it's a good thing." And he encouraged me. If it wouldn't be for those 45 minutes, I probably would not have applied for this position. And the rest is history. And once I got the position, on the day it became public, the first call I got was from Rabbi Lord Sachs, wishing me Mazel Tov and Hatzlacha Rabba. A few years before that, also the week of Parashat Chayei Sarah, I was privileged to hear a sermon from Rabbi Lord Sachs on Shabbat morning at Western Marble Arch. It is a speech which I will never forget. He described how the Sedra mainly features two episodes: the purchase of the cave of Machpelah as a burial place for Sarah, and Eliezer finding a wife for Yitzchak. But why are these two stories significant? At that moment, Abraham was 137 years old, and God had made him two promises: that the land of Israel would be his, and that he would have many descendants. These promises were made to him on many, many occasions, yet not one of them had actually happened. He didn't own any land in Israel, and Yitzchak, who he was told would be a spiritual heir, was yet to marry and have children. So what happens next? Abraham decides to do something about it. He approaches the Hittites, and the Torah describes the negotiations at length. Straight after this, we are told about Eliezer's mission to find the wife for Yitzchak, which is also told in great detail. But why does the Torah focus so much on these two stories? What is the message which we are supposed to learn when we read these verses? Rabbi Lord Sachs answered by writing this in his Covenant and Conversation 7 years ago. God promises, but we have to act. God promised Abraham the land, but he had to buy the first field. God promised Abraham many descendants, but Abraham had to ensure that his son was married and to a woman who would share the life of the covenant, so that Abraham would have, as we say today, Jewish grandchildren. Despite all the promises, God does not and will not act alone. He gives us responsibility, and only by exercising it do we reach our full stature as human beings. God saved Noah from the flood, but Noah had to make the ark. He gave us the land of Israel, but we had to always fight the battles. God gives us the strength to act, but we have to do the deed. What changes the world, what fulfills our destiny, is not what God does for us, but what we do for God. These words of Rabbi Sachs are a gift and inspiration to us all. But Rabbi Sachs didn't just preach and write about this, but like all of his ideas, he lived it. As a student after meeting the Lubavitcher Rebbe, he decided to dedicate his life to the Jewish people. Throughout his career as a preacher, he made sure to craft beautiful speeches which made the Torah sing to the audiences. At his chief rabbi installation back in 1991, he inspired Anglo Jewry to initiate a decade of renewal, which led to unprecedented innovation across our community. And upon stepping down as chief rabbi, he worked tirelessly day and night, bringing his message to the world. Avraham Avinu and Rabbi Lord Sachs taught us that it's not about what God does for us, but it's about what we do for God. And if we do this, then just like with Avraham and Rabbi Sachs, those around us will proclaim, Nasi Elokim Ata B'Tochenu. You are a prince of God in our midst. At Rabbi Sachs's funeral last Sunday, Diane Binstock said that back in the 1990s, Rabbi Sachs said the following: "When I die, I don't want to be remembered as a man who wrote lots of books. I don't want to be known as the man who was the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. I want to be remembered as the man who gave out sweets to the children in shul." Diane Binstock went on to say that in a sense, we are all Rabbi Sachs's children to whom he gave sweets. The sweets, of course, being his writings, his broadcasts, his Torah. This idea from Chai Sarah is just one of his many sweets he gave us. May this sweet and others continue to sweeten our lives for many years to come. And as others have said, we wish Lady Elaine and all the Sachs family a Chaim Aruchim. I now continue with the memorial prayer with the Azkara. Everyone make sure to answer Amen at the end, even though we're not together physically, we're here virtually, and everyone should answer Amen at the end. El malei rachamim shochein bamromim hametzeit menucha tachat kanafei hashechina b'ma'alot kedoshim etzaharim k'zohar harakia mazhirim et nishmat morenu harav Yaakov Tzvi ben David Aryeh shalach li'olamo ana barachamim yastirehu b'seitek k'nafav li'olamim v'yitzro b'tzra hachayim et nishmato adonai hu nachalato v'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo v'nomar amen.
Amen. Rabbi Taylor, thank you so much for your beautiful words and for the Azkara. Another reason for us to be so thankful to Rabbi Sachs, the fact you've now joined us here at BES. Thank you so much for your contribution this evening. Friends, I want to thank all of the speakers for being so open in sharing their personal thoughts and memories of Rabbi Sachs with us this evening. You know, Rabbi Sachs famously said that there's no Hebrew word for history. Instead, we talk about zachor, about memory, because it's personal. And we wish we all have, we've shared here all of our own personal memories of Rabbi Sachs, and he will live on in all of our memories. Yizachron Baruch, may his memory be for a blessing. been said, we send our wishes of Yichud Shamim of long life to Lady Elaine and all of his family. They should only know simchas from now on. Good times to be together as a family, and good memories of Rabbi Sachs. We're going to end, as we know, Rabbi Sachs had a very strong affinity with the Shabbaton choir, and particularly with Stephen's composition of Oseh Shalom. So we're going to end with that if the technology works. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we're going to play out with Oseh Shalom.
Friends, I want to thank on your behalf our two lovely young gifted pianists from JFS, Jessica Anson, Natalie Roberts. Thank you so much. And now can we please welcome back Rabbi Danny Bergson, cousin Avromi Freilich. On the 24th of November 1984, one of the most famous musical recordings in history, Band Aid, took place in the studio of Trevor Hall in West London. And on the 30th of April 2008, we recorded in the very same studio a composition by our musical director, Stephen Levey, written with the encouragement of the Chief Rabbi, to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the State of Israel. As of this morning, this song has received on YouTube no fewer than 1,736,655 hits. Requests come in from across the world for the composition and the arrangement. And this song will now bring to a close this unique tribute to our Chief Rabbi. And so I ask Chief Rabbi Lord Sachs, please join us on stage. And sing with us the words with which General Shkedi ended his earlier address to us. Oseh shalom bimromav hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. May peace reign with us, our people, indeed, in the whole of this fractured world. Amen.
Oseh shalom bimromav u'yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol Yisrael ve'yimaru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav u'yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol Yisrael ve'yimaru amen.
children go to their bedtime, I'd like them to sing again Anim Smirot. Natalie, where are you? Where's Natalie? Where's Jessica? Come back. A quick encore.